Welcome to our channel. Today we explore the fascinating and deeply emotional journey of the beloved comedian and entertainer Red Skelton. Known for his boundless humor and ability to bring joy to audiences worldwide, Red's life behind the curtain tells a story of resilience, loss, and unwavering dedication to his craft. From humble beginnings to becoming a household name in comedy, Red Skelton's life was filled with triumphs and heartbreaks. Stay with us as we uncover the highs and lows of a man whose laughter masked a world of pain. Let's take it all the way back to 1913, to a modest family home in Indiana where Red Skelton, officially born as Richard Skelton, entered the world. He was the youngest of 4 sons, yet he never got to meet his father, also named Joseph, who had made a living as a clown. He was an entertainer too, but in a far more precarious environment, working under the big top in a traveling circus. Tragically, Joseph lost his life in a bizarre accident. While performing at the circus, a tent collapsed on him. Imagine that heartbreak for a pregnant widow, a husband gone before the baby's first cries, a fatherless child raised on whispered memories of someone who used to bring audiences to their feet before fate's cruel blow ended it all. Young Richard would spend his whole life chasing his father's comic shadow, knowing he'd never get to stand alongside him on a stage. The Skelton family's income, which was already modest, nosedived after Joseph's untimely death. They truly struggled. This was not a gentle, will-make-do brand of poverty, but the sort of crippling financial crisis that leaves neighbors wary of offering so much as a cup of sugar for fear of never seeing it replaced. In a small community, reputation is everything, and once you're labeled too poor, that stigma can make people shy away entirely. So from his earliest days, the little boy who would grow into Red Skelton felt the chill of isolation. It was a stigma that bled into every dimension of his life, including the heartbreak of an early thwarted romance. A youthful Red, still called Richard by some, fell head over heels for a neighborhood girl, but her parents refused to let the two continue seeing each other. Their reasoning? He'd never amount to anything, and so, though he was just a child, he tasted bitterness early, fueling an internal vow to outshine everyone's dire predictions. An empty wallet and a legacy of clowning might have daunted someone else, but it actually fueled Red's sense of humor. Even from a young age, he discovered that making jokes, particularly outlandish physical gags, was a way to negotiate situations that felt otherwise punishing. It started innocently enough. He lied about his age to land a job selling newspapers on the streets. He didn't have enough cash for new clothes or shoes, but he had a knack for pestering passers-by until they either laughed in exasperation or caved in to buy a paper. He was a red-headed kid with a persistent streak, and it turned out that persistence can sometimes turn the tide. What he didn't know was that one random encounter while hawking newspapers would catapult him toward his grand future. One afternoon, an unassuming man strolled by as Red was hustling papers. Sizing the man up in a matter of seconds, Red asked him, "Looking for something to do tonight?" With typical gusto, he pointed across the street to a theater marquee. That evening's show was a touring act featuring a well-known comedian, Ed Wynn, straight from New York. Red was a big dreamer, so he blurted out, "That's what I'm going to do when I grow up. I'll make people laugh." The stranger seemed intrigued, and Red told him he couldn't afford the ticket, but wished he could go. Unbeknownst to the boy, the stranger was Ed Wynn himself, amused and touched by this fervent desire. Wynn pulled out $1, a small fortune to the child, and bought Red's remaining newspapers. But he didn't stop there. He also handed the boy a ticket to see the show. More than that, he handed him a rare gift that every budding entertainer longs for, a foot in the door. Overwhelmed by Wynn's kindness, Red sprinted home and gave his mother the $1. She returned a dime so he could buy a treat at the show's concession stand. Then, arriving at the theater that evening, Red discovered not just seats and bright lights, but also the exhilarating revelation that he was the guest of honor. When Ed Wynn took the stage, he acknowledged this scrappy newspaper boy, and from that moment on, Red's path was set. He tasted the stage lights, even if only from the perspective of the front row, and it became the air he wanted to breathe for the rest of his life. That single spark of recognition flipped a switch in young Red's mind. He realized that if he could be cunning enough, if he could hustle hard enough, he might just make laughter his full-time profession. But how does a kid with no money, limited schooling, and a father who died before he was born become a star? In Red's case, he threw himself into the only big hustle that existed at the time, vaudeville. First, he had to lie about his age to get on stage. Then he auditioned for just about anything. He joined the John Lawrence Theater Company, taking on dramatic roles, though comedic elements kept peeking out every time. During one performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin, he found himself on a malfunctioning treadmill in the background. As it began to run backward, he lost his composure and yelled out something like, "Help! I'm backing into heaven." The audience roared with laughter. Right then, Red realized that the comedic mishaps he'd been trying to restrain were actually gold, pure comedic fuel for an audience hungry to laugh. Naturally, he found more stable comedic work in a traveling medicine show, the kind of old-time spectacle where snake oil salesmen pitched dubious elixirs, flanked by comedic acts to draw crowds. Red excelled in physical comedy, using his rubbery face and flailing limbs to evoke laughter from just about anyone. Every penny he earned he sent back home, ensuring that his mother and siblings had something to eat, as though trying to cleanse the memory of those hungry years. His mother worried that he was giving away his every cent, but Red assured her that performers on the road never starve. They could always find a place to sleep, whether it was in a wagon or behind the stage, and there was always a bit of free food, if you knew which door to knock on. Times were shifting, and the comedic stylings that once were considered racy were getting racier. Red, mindful of his mother's values, decided he didn't want to be part of shows that pushed boundaries too far. So, after a while, he left. He took on the role of MC at dance contests, though that crowd was hardly the gentler alternative he might have hoped for. One dancer, a feisty young woman named Edna Stillwell, took him to task for cracking stale jokes. He challenged her to do better, and to his surprise, she could. A year later, the two married, uniting not just in matrimony but as comedic partners. Edna didn't merely offer feedback. She wrote jokes for Red, managed his contracts, and even gave him the kind of education he had missed after leaving school so young. They were a powerhouse duo, though in a few years, their marriage would make a surprising pivot. While Edna was boosting Red's comedic arsenal, Red used his own brand of hustle to boost their finances during their travels. Legend has it that they found themselves low on funds, only 50 cents to spare. Red bought some cheap bars of soap, unwrapped them, cut them up, and then rewrapped the slices in foil from old cigarette cartons. With a little patter, he was a born salesman, he hawked them as eyeglass fog removal treatments. Naturally, they were just lumps of soap, but the comedic hucksterism captured the attention of passers-by, and the couple ended up with enough money to keep moving. It was more than just a silly scheme. It underscored the capacity of Red's resourcefulness. Even if it meant a bit of trickery, he'd do what it took to keep the show on the road. In Montreal, they had a stroke of comedic inspiration that would change Red's destiny yet again. Sitting in a diner, Red found himself fascinated by how patrons dunked their donuts into coffee. It seemed such a trivial habit, yet the sight made him think, could this be turned into a comedic routine? Sure enough, He created an act lampooning donut dunking, and it was an instant crowd pleaser. The humor sprang from the ordinary. People recognized themselves in those motions, the comedic timing of drip, drip, splash. Word spread, and soon it reached some important ears, none other than President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. In 1937, President Roosevelt was apparently so entertained by the concept of a donut dunking routine that he invited Red Skelton to perform at a presidential birthday celebration at the White House. Think about that. A poor newspaper boy turned clown is now traveling to the White House to make the nation's leader laugh. That alone would be enough to script an entire heartfelt feature film, but Red was just getting started. During the toast, Red lifted the president's glass and made a joke about being careful with what he drank, remarking that he'd once been rolled in a place like this. It took nerve to crack wise about the commander-in-chief in front of an entire crowd, but that's who Red was, a clown with just enough cheek to make everyone, from the simplest townsfolk to the president, chuckle. The White House performance put him on the map in a way that few comedic bits ever do. Soon he was scouted by Hollywood stars like Mickey Rooney, who told him to come to Los Angeles, test his comedic powers for the big screen, and see if that spotlight might be even brighter than Broadway or vaudeville. Red had tried to break into Hollywood before, but stumbled. This time, riding the wave of success sparked by his donut dunking routine, he performed it for a screen test. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, recognized they might have a comedic gem on their hands and signed him to a film contract. The film industry was famously controlling, and Red discovered that when you sign on the dotted line with a powerhouse studio like MGM, you lose certain freedoms. For one, they had the right to limit his appearances anywhere else, stage, radio, or other competing studios, unless they gave the green light. For a man who thrived on live comedy, improvisation, and audience interaction, that felt stifling. To make matters worse, they often cast him in roles that tested his comedic humility. In 1944's Bathing Beauty, they dressed him in a tutu. Although Red loved a good gag, shaving his chest, back, and underarms to fit the outfit felt more humiliating than hilarious. He got his revenge in a sly way. While filming Neptune's Daughter in 1949, MGM commissioned a very elaborate, expensive piano specifically for one scene. Yet on the day of shooting, that piano was nowhere to be found. Studio execs panicked until Red strolled in, wearing a mischievous smile, and offered to rent them a piano he just happened to have that looked exactly like the missing one. The higher-ups at MGM, initially incredulous, followed him to his apartment, only to see that the piano was indeed identical, right down to certain custom features. He proposed a daily rental fee of $50, but with production hemorrhaging money as they waited, he stood firm until the exasperated studio boss eventually gave in to a whopping $1,000 a day rental. The not-so-small detail that Red had acquired the original piano from the set with the help of some stagehands was never formally acknowledged. MGM ended up paying big for something they already owned, and Red laughed all the way to the bank. Despite such comedic triumphs, Red wasn't entirely content in Hollywood. He was an entertainer more than an actor, someone who thrived on spontaneity and off-the-cuff humor. Directors who preferred strict scripts often found him exasperating. In fact, Jack Donahue once lamented that if Red managed to deliver a line in proper English, they'd better type it up on the spot and incorporate it, because he might never say it the same way twice. That freewheeling style was the essence of Red's gift, but it also caused friction. He had so many comedic instincts swirling in his head that he couldn't resist using them, whether or not they were in the script. During this time, his personal life was also in flux. Edna Stillwell, who had been so instrumental in his rise, writing jokes, negotiating deals, and tutoring him in whatever academic gaps he had, announced after 12 years of marriage that she wanted a divorce. Initially, Red thought she was joking. This was the woman who crafted his comedic persona in many ways. How could she walk away? He knew she was serious when he heard the divorce announcement on NBC radio before she told him personally. Yet in a twist that baffled many, Edna continued to serve as his manager and gag writer even after they split. She believed that ensuring Red's success as a performer was more important than letting bitterness overshadow everything they'd built. Their arrangement might have seemed odd, but it worked. He kept producing comedic gold, and she kept doing her behind-the-scenes magic. Shortly thereafter, Red seemed ready to rebound quickly. He claimed an engagement to Muriel Morris, going as far as obtaining a marriage license. But fate intervened in a truly major way. The Army drafted him. If you think about it, that was near the end of World War II, so tensions were high. And newly single or not, Red Skelton wasn't exempt from the draft. It turned out he wouldn't be marrying Muriel because she backed out. Different accounts exist. One said she left him for a wealthy businessman in Mexico. Another that she changed her mind with no new beau in sight. For a comedic genius, his personal life certainly had a pinch of heartbreak, but that heartbreak would soon intensify in a way he couldn't have anticipated. The Army sent Red to Camp Roberts in California, where the troops greeted him with affectionate teasing, like slapping a sign on his barracks door reading, "Tour a movie star's home, 25 cents. Red took it in stride. In fact, part of his job was to boost morale, performing multiple shows a day. That constant comedic output eventually led to a physical and mental breakdown. He started stuttering severely. The trauma of performing so often, coupled with the realities of war, nearly destroyed his comedic spark. Yet he encountered fellow servicemen in hospital wards who were far worse off, missing limbs, dealing with catastrophic injuries. One particular private was so ill that doctors considered his survival unlikely. Seeing that soldiers' despair seemed to spark something in Red, he decided to perform small comedic routines at the hospital, aiming to lift spirits. To everyone's astonishment, that soldier improved enough to be taken off critical status, and in turn the repeated comedic routines helped Red himself recover from his stutter. It was as if healing someone else's emotional pain gave him the strength to heal his own. The Army might have nearly broken him, but ironically, it also reminded him that laughter could be a genuine lifeline. He finally left the Army on a medical discharge, citing a throat condition, though rumors swirled he had a heart condition. Whatever the precise reason, leaving the military coincided with another pivotal event in Red's life. He married Georgia Davis, a model he had been seeing, and declared that the biggest fear he had was shipping out before they could exchange vows. Thus began another chapter, freed from both MGM's restrictive contract and his Army obligations. Red plunged headfirst into radio and television with NBC. This gave birth to The Red Skelton Show, which lit up American television for a full 2 decades, from 1951 to 1971. Unscripted, fast-paced, and loaded with physical gags, the show gave him a platform to deploy his comedic imagination with minimal constraints. Not that it was always smooth sailing. NBC network censors silenced Red for 2 entire minutes on live television. He'd been aiming pointed jokes at an imagined network executive, and the higher-ups felt the jabs cut too close. They blanked him out. Outraged but not defeated, Red eventually moved to CBS, bringing comedic writer Sherwood Schwartz into the fold. Yet Schwartz demanded a contract clause forbidding Red from seeing the script in advance of the show. The result? Red would sometimes pause mid-performance, staring at the audience, disclaiming that whatever they were hearing, he certainly hadn't written it. In his personal life, though, storms kept brewing. Red had a serious fall on some stairs, injuring his ankle, and that mishap triggered a cardiac asthma attack that nearly killed him. Doctors at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica said he had only one step left to go before meeting death. Whether or not that was exaggeration, it underscored how precarious his health sometimes was. People close to him mentioned that he struggled with the bottle occasionally, though accounts differ. He might have avoided alcohol for long stretches or indulged heavily when times were tough. Red had 2 children with Georgia Davis, a daughter, Valentina, and a son, Richard. Those kids lit up his life in ways no stage applause ever could. In 1958, however, just days shy of little Richard's 10th birthday, the boy died from leukemia. For a man who spent his entire existence chasing laughter, to witness his child slip away must have felt downright cruel. Some said it changed him forever. He became more introspective, less boisterously freewheeling, as if part of his comedic flame had been permanently snuffed out. The heartbreak contributed to marital tension with Georgia, leading to more personal struggles. And yet Red never stopped performing. The Red Skelton show, despite high ratings, was canceled by CBS in 1970. He moved to NBC briefly, but never replicated that same success or longevity. Privately, he harbored resentment against television executives whom he felt had betrayed him, discarding him after 2 successful decades. This might have dredged up the old feelings of rejection from his poverty-stricken youth, or the heartbreak of those neighbors in Indiana who thought he'd be a nobody. But even if the networks no longer wanted him on prime time, he continued to find other avenues for expression. Audiences recognized him as a comedic clown, but few suspected that behind the scenes he was also a painter and not just a hobbyist. He developed a real craft for painting clowns, using vivid colors and subtle shading to reveal hidden emotions behind the red noses and oversized shoes. Some art dealers even claimed he earned more money from his paintings than from his comedic appearances. It was as if the comedic clown on stage had to find a deeper, perhaps more introspective reflection on canvas. Nor did his creativity stop there. He wrote stories, composed music, and, some say, turned out thousands of original musical compositions. That tremendous creative energy had to go somewhere, and with the heartbreak he'd endured, it made sense that he'd find solace in multiple art forms. Throughout these later years, he remained grateful for every bit of happiness he could muster. He'd remind people of an old piece of advice his mother gave him. Son, don't take life too seriously. You're not going to get out of it alive anyway. It was his credo, a gentle philosophical shrug that freed him to be silly without hesitation. When pressed about how he could remain jovial despite losing a child, suffering various health scares, and feeling betrayed by networks, he'd respond by emphasizing the fleeting nature of existence. Laughter, in his view, was the best defiance of all the sadness, all the heartbreak. His comedic legacy, though overshadowed in later decades by new stars and changing tastes, remained iconic to those who remembered him from his golden years. And ironically, the comedic persona he created, an array of clownish alter egos, each with a unique voice and manner, was perhaps a coping mechanism, letting him escape life's tragedies by vanishing into a swirl of characters. He gave them names, physical quirks, and punchlines. He was more than the standard variety show host. He was a comedic inventor with a streak of unpredictability. Now, decades after his heyday, you can still find reruns of the Red Skelton show floating around. You might catch glimpses of his wide grin, outlandish sketches, and that cunning spark in his eyes that declared, "I'm about to do something unexpected." Younger audiences might not realize how close this man came to never leaving the poverty of his childhood behind. They might not suspect that behind that jolly face was a father forever changed by the death of a child. They might not know about the piano he borrowed from MGM or how he once kept a plane full of terrified passengers, calm as two engines, went dead mid-flight. But these layers of stories, comedic or tragic, made him who he was. Red Skelton was on a flight from Rome to London, expecting a routine hop across Europe. Then two engines cut out in midair, sending passengers into panic. A priest on board even prepared to administer final rites. The priest turned to Red and basically said, "You look after your department, and I'll look after mine," implying that Red's job was to keep folks calm, if not outright entertained, in their final moments. True to form, Red jumped into comedic gear, making jokes that somehow reassured everyone. By some miracle, the last two engines held on until the pilot could land safely on a small airstrip in France. It sounds almost too improbable, like a scene from one of his movies. By the twilight of his life, Red Skelton was less frequently in the public eye, but he never fully retired from entertaining. He'd occasionally pop up in cameo appearances, variety specials, or interviews, still wearing his playful grin. And in these late interviews, you could see that, beneath the silly surfaces, he was a performer deeply in tune with humanity's pain and need for laughter. He even said once that if he had to choose between living a life of hardship or living a quiet life without the comedic spark, he'd pick the former because the laughter was worth it. Some older fans also remember that Red Skelton was a devout champion of clean comedy, a sharp contrast to the edgier stand-up that started emerging in the late 60s and beyond. He believed in humor that appealed to the widest possible audience, bridging generational gaps and uniting entire families. Sure, some critics called his humor corny or dated, but others argued it was a universal brand of physical and situational comedy that never goes out of style. Even long after his variety show ended, he had a reservoir of fans who adored him precisely because his comedic routines felt warm and welcoming, untinged by cynicism. And so, if there's one piece of wisdom to glean from Red Skelton's winding life, it might be this: humor can be the connective tissue between grief and hope. Even when tragedy robs you of something precious, like the father you never met or the child you lost, the ability to make people laugh becomes both an escape and a healing mission. Red Skelton lived that truth until the end. He was both the clown on stage and a haunted soul off it. He was a man whose unstoppable comedic presence came from a hidden well of sorrow he transformed into joy for others. So here we are, remembering a figure who dazzled millions but still ended every performance by walking back onto an empty stage, alone with the echoes of applause. If he were able to peek out from behind the curtain one more time, he might offer that silly grin and remind us, much as his mother reminded him, that none of us gets out of life alive, so we may as well enjoy the ride. And if that enjoyment involves squirting flowers, outlandish costumes, or 1,000 improvised jokes, so be it. The greatest gift you can give the world might just be a reason to laugh when everything else seems too heavy. Red Skelton's life was a testament to the healing power of laughter and the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable loss. His legacy as a comedian, entertainer, and artist lives on, reminding us to cherish the moments of joy and connection that life offers. If this story moved you or taught you something new, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching, and join us again as we share more incredible stories from the lives of legends. See you next time.